happy birthday. Finally, I can tell you in person. I've been trying to talk to you for a week. You've been so busy on your 80th
It has
year.
been celebrated about 6 times now, so I have a feeling I'm almost 90.
Through having celebrated so many times.
Yes, first in Holland and then in Germany and then etc., etc.
Well, just very quickly, so that we can also put this remarkable man into context as well. We're going to be talking mostly about Berlin and Germany and Europe, as I said. But Cees is an incredibly broad writer. He's a wonderful novelist, one of the greatest novelists we have, I think. And if you haven't read any of the novels or any of the poetry or the travel writing, the essays, just go out there and get them. They're just beautiful, beautiful writing. So he's the author of numerous novels, poetry collections, essays, travel literature. The bibliography in our beloved Wikipedia is so long, I didn't even print it out because of the waste of paper it would have been. And he's probably one of the most famous books in this country is Roads to Santiago, and this one I think is way up there as well. Now, let's talk about Berlin, Germany. And the very, very first question is, why is Germany so attractive to you, personally and professionally?
You mean the Germans to me or I to Germany?
Why do you write about Germany? Why do you spend so much time there? Why is it an interesting country for you?
Well, we, as Dutch, have a sort of negative history with Germans, first of all. I mean, and I remember as a child, 6 years old, we lived near a military airport. And that the 10th of May 1940, these German warplanes came over our house, and a terrible noise, an incredible noise, that somehow the noise has obliterated my childhood memories before that date. This sounds like ridiculous, but it is true.
You can't remember anything up until that date?
No, though it also has dawned upon me that I was told at a certain point, which my mother violently refused to acknowledge, that my family moved house 8 times between my birth and that first day of the war. There's a reason for that, but okay. Anyway, I was frightened by the noise. My father, who would die later in the war, in a bombardment, was fascinated. At the horizon, which was red because of Rotterdam, he had put an easy chair on the balcony to watch. And I wasn't in the mood, apparently, as a 6-year-old. I trembled, and so they put ice-cold water over me. Somehow, all these things together make you... And then, during the war, I mean, you saw the uniforms. You saw people, somebody not being shot, but having been shot. I mean, with "I am a plunderer." Things like the childhood memories. There was later, when it was the hunger winter in The Hague, when my parents were divorced, and my father then in the hunger winter sent me to my mother, who was in the country. In the country, you saw, like, British pilots hanging in a tree. You know, the war has quite an impact on a child, I can tell you. And we were liberated by the Canadians, and I still smell the motor of that first Canadian who put me in front of him on this thing. And my father died in February 45. All that altogether is... So Germany is already, you could hear Hitler sometimes raving on the radio, not knowing what it was.
You remember his voice?
Yes, I do, yes. There you never know, because later you see so many documentaries. There you may be...
you don't know what the real
yes, but still you recognize
was.
it. And there was a certain tune when the German headquarters were to announce a victory. You know, there was a certain sort of Wagnerian tam, 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 this kind of thing, and then excited voices. And then later on it all turned, and you felt as a child, there was, for example, the day that they thought they would already have lost the war. And then many of the collaborators went. And that's what we all Axing Day, you know. But then again, it took another year to liberate the north of the Netherlands.
But
so all in all, After the war, Holland had been, let's say, not destroyed, but there was a lot of destruction. And it was all very grey, and it was all very poor, and it was all very sad. And when I grew up, I've been educated in monastery schools by Franciscan and Augustinian monks. My father had died, as I've told. So where did you want to go after the war? You did not want to go to Germany. So I want to go to Spain, Italy, and all that was, for me, that was the opening up. That's why I wrote this book on Spain, which is called Roads to Santiago in this country. You know, you come first to Italy and there's light and there's everything and opera buffa. You think this is the way to live. Then you come to Spain, where the military still wore German helmets. So again, Spain is a harsher country. It's no comparison with Italy. Still, Spain then became more or less the love of my life, and Germany, you don't think of it. And then I met some very good friends in Holland who had been in concentration camps. There was a sort of evening where young poets and writers came together, and the host was an elder poet who had been in Buchenwald. And then I noticed that he and another friend, younger than he was, both had been in Natzweiler, which was a Nacht- und Nebelkamp, and in Buchenwald, and that they had a very special kind of fascination with Germany, understandable, but still also strange. Why? And then the moment came that one of them, and then the two of them, in 1963, by then I was 20, said, we are going to the Congress of the Communist Party in East Germany. Do you want to come? And I said, yes. That is one of the things leading up to this, but the other one was about 5 years before, when two photographer friends called me. This is 1956. And they called me and said, there's a revolt going on in Hungary. Do you want to come? But you have 10 minutes. So I said yes, and we drove up, and I was in the middle of that. And that was my first real...
So it's 1956?
1956, yes. That was my first real encounter with communism. And a lot of my nice friends were leaning to the left and all that. And suddenly there, I looked this whole thing into the face, which was, I still remember, I don't know whether it's in this book, but it smelled of war, first of all. There were the bodies of Secret Service with the people had put money in their mouth and spat on them, you know. And it smelled, as a child, you smell the war. So it smelled like that.
You remember the smells?
I do, yes. And then, for me, a focal, or whatever you say in English, moment was when a young girl came up to me and said, I was myself young, when are you coming to help us? Because Radio Free Europe had been bombarding Hungary with all kinds of things. And they thought the West would come and help them. What in fact happened was that the Russians made, how do you call that, a pincer movement. And I got out and could write my first journalistic piece for a Dutch newspaper. And came back with a completely, well, you couldn't say I had much of an opinion before that, but this helped me have one. And then these poor people, you know, you knew that you were out, but they were in. And then when 6 years later, these two friends wanted me to come to the East German Communist Party Congress, I went with them. That was different because they had been in the war in Germany, and Eastern Germany sounded much more like Germany than Western Germany.
But Eastern Germany was always more interesting for us than Western Germany at the time. I mean, for journalists, and I'm a journalist as well. I mean, that's...
Yes, definitely. But the East Germans somehow thought that all the blame of what had happened in the war would be on the West, not on them. But you know, you had people in Eastern Germany who had been heroes in the war, in what we call the war.
The Second World War.
Yes, and who were horrible in the East, you know, people in the Stasi, in the information service. So this whole build-up of things having to do with Germany, and then still in Holland, a lot of antagonism. You know,
but it's
famous
interesting.
Football World Cup, you know.
It always comes
Holland
back to
against
football
Germany.
in the end.
Oh, you have no.
I didn't think you were a
those
football
poor
fan.
11 players had to do the whole World War again, and it felt like a terrible defeat when, in the end, Holland did not win, which they did not.
You know what's interesting to me is you're actually talking quite a lot about yourself, which I think is wonderful, but you don't often talk about yourself and your childhood and so on too. So it's wonderful that you are. And I'm going to bring you on to this because we've got so much. We've got the whole of Europe to discuss as well. Remember, no small matter. To start off with this, and this follows on from what you were saying, your journey to Germany in that sense. In this, you start this book in 1963, and it ends in 2012 with your last visit on behalf of this book. And you described yourself initially as a journalist, but these are basically, this is for me living history. What you witness is, from what I can tell, it's a mixture of diaries, you wrote journals, you were writing journalistic pieces, reflections, and there are photographs in here too, which are absolutely superb. In a kind of Sebald-like way, you've included the photographs in the book. And these are by Simone Sasson, by the way, a wonderful photographer who works with you very often. And you start this book in 1963, when you're crossing the border into Germany. Now, this is not actually in Berlin, it's Helmstadt, I think. And I can remember that moment of crossing the border before the Berlin Wall came down.
Well, these people coming
it's amazing,
with mirrors under the car.
Unforgettable.
And it's all, you know, what I'm trying to say about all this is, like you have these war films, like British war films, with all those people saying, "Jawohl, sir," you know, and,
in English accents,
and Germans always being imitated with their heavy, etc., etc. So we had that too, this antagonism to the language you don't want, and then there was a complete change, not in that particular
in the Netherlands.
No, not in the Netherlands now. Generally. Also, but there was something like imitation of German imitation. It was the enemy. We had been occupied for 5 years. You, at least, were never occupied, but we were occupied for 5 years. So when finally then they invited me for a whole year, I thought, what am I going to do a whole year? And that was the fatal year 89. After all that was digested, like 63 and the travels, every cliché about, negative cliché about Germans, if you had to cross, when I was living in West Berlin, if you had to cross in this famous Bahnhof Friedrichstraße or checkpoint, whatever, you know, it all became true because they were quite nasty, these.
You spoke about the light of Italy and Spain, but for me, in those times, going to a crossing also in Friedrichstraße and checkpoint, well, Friedrichstraße, it was dark. Everything was dark.
Very dark.
And grim.
And very, very, I mean, I described this, you could, when you lived in Berlin in that period, where could you walk? There was only one little village called Lübars, and I used to go out there on a Sunday and then and there you had all these towers where these men stood with their binoculars, and you knew if you would do one strange thing, you know, if people tried to get out, they would be shot, and that's what you call the Todesstreifen, which is, let's say,
the death strip. The
death strip, yes. You were liable to be shot if you ever tried. Many people did try, and many people were shot. That atmosphere, you know, and there is a compendium novel to this book. We have not discussed this. There's a compendium novel which was published by Macmillan and sank in this country like a stone. Yes.
I feel so ashamed.
No,
I do, because everywhere else, as you probably know, Cees is, an absolute major star, literary star, and here we take our time. We get there in the end.
No, but that book is called All Souls Day, and there the protagonist, who is a cameraman, who goes. He's lost his wife and child in a plane accident, so he is free. And he is, how shall I say this, CNN and everybody else employs him for the more horrible things in this world, like minefields in Cambodia or mass graves in Croatia and all that. And he meets a young student in Berlin. He has a group of friends in Berlin. He's converted to Germany in some way, as I have been, by meeting the right kind of people. And he tries to take her along this path, along the wall, where the wall was. And it's so interesting that landscapes have a way of obliterating everything. Because now the wall is gone in that particular place. I still know where it was. But if somebody here now goes there, he will never know. He will see. And it's interesting because it was also. Yeah, what?
I mean, I was in Berlin just a couple of weeks ago, and we happened to be staying near Checkpoint Charlie, and which was, if you think amazing. I was staying in a hotel near Checkpoint Charlie. When I think of, for me, I've been nearly every single year since I was a student in the 80s, and there were tourists posing with actors who play the Americans and the Russians, and they stand in front of sandbags at Checkpoint Charlie. I mean, you've probably seen it if you've been there. And you can stand there and you can put your arm around a soldier and be photographed at Checkpoint Charlie.
All that, like in Amsterdam, the Anne Frank house, which is near my house, on a given beautiful Sunday, there will be a queue up till Hay. No, that's one thing. If you are in Krakow, where I was last year for a literary festival, there are taxis with a sign saying Auschwitz means tourism. You know, all that confounds.
But the extraordinary thing about you, so you happened to be in Berlin before, you were there for nearly 2 years, 18 months in the end. You stayed on the west side of Berlin, and you happened to be there when the Berlin Wall fell.
Yes.
I mean, this is a gift for a writer.
I was interviewed at that very moment by a Dutch journalist. And then we were going to take a taxi. And suddenly, this is experience as a journalist, you know. On the radio, suddenly the voices became incredibly excited. And then the taxi driver was a young girl, and she says, the wall has fallen. I'll bring you there. You won't pay. And so we drove up there, and there they were standing, and you cannot imagine the wall. I had one very strange experience. After this had all happened, the actual fact of the wall standing in front of you when it was still a menacing thing, when it was dangerous and all that, many years later, about 10 years later, I was invited to Los Angeles, and since I had already written about it, I was invited because one university had bought a piece of the wall. And the rector magnificus of the university was going to unveil the piece of the wall. And there, with all these lovely American students in their light colors, and there stood this stone object. And I thought they will never know what it meant. You know,
I mean, to have seen what you've seen and to have written about it as you have in this book, it's in some ways it's a great privilege, isn't it, as a human being to witness these events?
Well, yes. You see, I met them. When they gave me a year, I thought a year is too much for me here. I don't want
to live in Berlin for that length of time.
And then it all happened, and then I stayed on, and I've met so many nice, interesting people.
And you were in the East a lot. You went over and you saw your publishers in the East.
Yes, well, that's another story. I was published already by a publisher in the East, which was rather strange, because the contents of my novel, Rituals, would be rather anti-state. And it was strange that they should publish me, but they did. But they also published Updike, and they published a few other people. And that was strange because there were no reviews. So when I asked them, how come the book is sold out, which it was, I don't know the amount, it was limited, I suppose. And I said, but how can you sell a book if there are no reviews? And they said, well, Flustercampagne. No.
What?
Flustercampagne.
So whisper campaign,
yes.
basically. Yes.
So they were so avid. They
Chinese
wanted
whispers.
books from the West. And these were nice people. I must say my editor was somebody in a wheelchair. He was a very nice man. And when the wall came down the next day, when they were all coming over to the West, I, on my own, walked against the crowds to the East. And also as a sympathy for this man. And I knew his boss was, of course, a communist, because you could be independently nice, but above you there would always be somebody who was independently not nice. And so I met these people again in different circumstances. And the great thing was, after we spoke, etc., I then, going back, I was one of the crowd coming back. And the great moment was when they, in the West, offered me a banana. Because that was the...
I had to pay $10 for a banana, and you got one free.
I got one free.
They were very valuable commodities, weren't they? No.
But then it really started. You see, nobody can understand Germany as it is now. It's 25 years ago. It's quarter century. It's really time. But then, you would have thought, now reunification, etc. No, all kinds of almost racism, like, you see that man, you see that kind of boots, he's from the East. You know, and they didn't, West Berlin was a sort of shop window for all that is good in the West and Europe, you know. They invited foreign artists, there was theater, there was everything. It was all subsidized. But when, in the end, that came which they all had so-called been hoping for, they didn't like it.
What did you make of it at the time? What did you think? I mean, because you're a great outsider, insider in everything you do. I mean, you also have this great ability to stand at the side of an event and look at it. And what were you thinking was going to happen, apart from this euphoric moment?
Well, you had, let's say, a great colleague like Günter Grass, who wanted the East not to remain a communist state, but he thought it could survive on its own, not completely immersed in the
submerged
capitalist West.
Into a big
And I thought
Germany.
that was absolute nonsense, and I still think it was. Because now, you see, it takes time. It will take another 25 years maybe, and there are many unpleasant things, but...
Do you see East Germany, the GDR, do you see it as a viable country, state?
No.
Did you ever see it as that?
There's, strangely enough, you see, our capitalist system is harsh on people. And, let's say, old people's care and all that was perfectly done in East Germany. The state was horrible, in my opinion, but a few things were, organized, and there was forms of solidarity, unless you were on the wrong side, of course. And so some people say we were better off then, and that are the kind of people that always would be better off in a state that takes more care of you. We don't. It's a difficult subject. But I was strongly for reunification. And some parts of East Germany are still poor. Some parts are rich now, because where the industries always were, near Leipzig and all that, but in the north. And that's where there is this rightist, neo-fascist, which, it's interesting.
When I was in Berlin, as I was saying a couple of weeks ago, I was asking friends and colleagues of mine who are mostly from the East, anyway, because I always thought the East was more interesting. And I was like, so how are you going to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall? And a couple of them even said, is it really the 25th anniversary? And these were people who'd actually lived through it. So in many ways, they have tried to forget. And one colleague of mine, a great translator of Shakespeare called Michael Hamburger, said to me, he said, well, we're certainly not going to be dancing in the streets. So there are still some who think that the wrong thing happened.
Well, I don't think so. I think it's natural that that country should reunite. Is
the 25th anniversary a cause for celebration?
Well, yes, I would say so, yes, because it meant much more than that. It's not only the east of Germany. It means that Poland and all these countries got their freedom back, and that those countries always belonged to Europe, could anew belong to Europe.
And it's the domino effect.
There was a very cruel division, made at Yalta, which is incredible that three gentlemen sit there and cut a continent in half and condemn several old European countries to, well, forms of whatever you call it, slavery or whatever it was, but I mean, it was at least certainly not freedom. And I must say, I have Hungarian friends, like a great writer called Laszlo Földényi, who, when he was invited by, let's say, nice and interesting people in the West, he noticed that those people, those friends to the left, had certain admiration for these totalitarian states, and they couldn't understand. They said they had never to live under this system.
But they admired it, what, intellectually, or?
Well, I never did.
What was the reason they gave?
What?
What was the reason they gave?
That they thought there was more solidarity there, and there was not the terror of capitalism.
How do you feel
about...
And,
it immediately happened. Many of the publishers, the intellectual life at a certain level, if you were conforming to the state, was quite, you had theater, you had everything, but... And now that, a lot of beautiful bookshops have disappeared, and you find all kinds, they were so hungry for books before, and now they have all the magazines and all the vulgar West utterings.
How do you feel about Germany today? I mean, as I say, the final visit for this book was 2012. And I mean, you said some really funny things, which I wrote down. You said everyone, of course, in Germany is affected by history, but there was a wonderful quote which I wrote down from your book as well, which I had to write because I don't think it's your quote actually. I think it's from one of your colleagues. German intellectuals can't even shit or piss without ideology. And what's interesting?
It's not
you, but it's in the book. I don't think you'd use rude words in that way. Actually, you're a much more elegant writer, but.
No, but you see, I feel, having lived there now on and off, and I go every year, a few months, to a very different part of Germany, which is Baden-Württemberg.
Which is beautiful.
Europeans do not know Germany. Again, one has to say there are lots of Europeans who do not know England. But the great thing about Europe, the negative thing, is that the peoples do not really know each other. It takes lifetimes to do that. It's very interesting because I had to reverse a lot of my thinking about Germany by meeting the right kind of people. Still, history, what has happened, cannot be undone. But the Germans themselves have the largest problem with that. I remember when I tell, it goes like this. Somebody says, your father died in the war. I say, yes. Yes, at the bombardment. I say, yes. Oh, it's terrible. And I say, but it was an English bombardment. This is true. The bombardment of The Hague in 1945, at the beginning, was a terrible mistake. It was a real mistake that has never been acknowledged as such. But it was a mistake, and they found out that somebody mistook whatever you call it, horizontal for vertical lines in some map. And this was a residential quarter, which was completely destroyed. There was no industry, there was no war industry. It was an unnecessary bombardment, and many thousands died. But you see, the Germans have such a problem with their past that, this is a silly little anecdote, but it's true, so that they say, Thank God not us, you see.
And is your interest in Germany partly to understand the complexity of that country? Is that why it continues to fascinate you? You know, how did this happen, these 12 evil years? How did they happen? Is this part of your interest, is to constantly try to understand that nation?
Yes, but I mean, you have to go down for hundreds of years. And at a certain point, you know, France was always France and England was always England, but Germany was 300 Germanys, which is what people do not really understand. They were all tiny, small city-states and cantons and whatever you call them.
Kingdoms.
Yes, kingdoms. I mean, if you think of Goethe, what was Goethe? Weimar, what state was it? It was a small city with pigs in the, you know, it's...
I think that sounds like a cue for a reading too, because you've got some wonderful extracts
well,
lined up for us.
You know, sometimes writing does that to you, that you can get things more precise than talking. Though I love talking.
And you do very well.
Now you see here, just a few little fragments. Now I've gone to this, and you can't see it here, but there's an enormous statue somewhere in the West of Hermann, whom they call Hermann, and people had told me about him. And he defeated 4 Roman legions in the year whatever, near zero. And so he was supposedly the founder of Germany, but there was never a Germany. And that took a long time. So Hermann, when I finally found him, Hermann stood firm, but then he weighs more than 42 tons, including his pedestal, you say?
Pedestal.
Pedestal, including his pedestal. He stands over 50 meters tall, and he does not need to worry about his helmet flying off or his skirt blowing up. He's fastened together with 30,924 copper rivets. I, on the other hand, was finding it all rather tricky. You know, he stands there and he has this thing, Deutsche Einigkeit meine Stärke, Deutschlands Macht. German unity, my strength, Germany's might. And then I say, history, that old anachronistic liar, is up to its old tricks again. Because immer zerrissen und geteilt, said Hölderlin, always torn apart and divided, and the numbers back him up. At the Peace of Westphalia you say, I suppose, in 1648, 300 German states were recognized as sovereign, each with its own court, its own despot, enlightened or otherwise, and the accompanying officialdom and cult of obedience, which was to have such dramatic consequences even into the 20th century. Because that is what it is. See, over the centuries, when France and England became centrally governed units, the German nation was repeatedly blasted by fragmentation bombs of both domestic and foreign manufacture. And everyone was accustomed to this, not least of all the Germans themselves. So this is, you know, you cannot understand the country unless you know all this. And at the very end of my book, is that what I'm supposed to read now? You tell me.
You do. This is your.
You know,
your
I got. You know, you get so. It was an interesting spiritual adventure to be in it and to try to understand it. And I think
Did it change you?
Yes, absolutely. And it's the last place, I would say. Like, if you read the Frankfurter Allgemeine, I used to read the English Sunday papers, unless they became so immensely commercial and thick, kilos of paper that you have to take home. And when you buy the Frankfurter Allgemeine, it's about as if you buy, next to the news, you buy about a book of essays. It's for somebody who does what I do, it's very appealing, I must say.
And
it's a very serious country.
It is a very serious country. And you read in lots of different languages, so that's also...
No, but that's not the point now. But I read it...
a good European.
But in that novel, that which is called All Souls Day, I said that before, there is more musings about the character, because the main character is introduced by a Dutch sculptor who understands the Germans, because he's been there for 20 years. And that's a lot of fun, because he will always repeat this. It's an earnest country. And, you know, for example, in Amsterdam, if you stand in front of a red light, you watch to the left and the right, and there's a car coming, then you cross. Not in Berlin. You just stand there, and you look at each other, and you think, for Christ's sake. And I remember
There's no traffic, why not?
You know, we in Amsterdam, we are anarchists, so we will cross. It's red, so you cross.
But you know what's so funny? You wrote also in this book that because you said there's not an awful lot happening in my country. So I think that's why you kept going back to Berlin as well, wasn't it?
Maybe. But anyway, I then cross, and then you hear a voice behind you. That one tries to commit suicide. Okay. And so I asked my friend who'd been there, living there for 20 years, I say, what do you do? Do you cross or do you do? If you know there's no car coming, do you cross or don't you cross? He says, I cross only when there are no children, which I thought was perfect. You know?
I think that's the right answer.
So at the end of these 2 years, I say, I know that I must say farewell to this melting land, because it was melting, you know, everything was...
a wonderful image.
Structures, it was such a strange period. You must imagine that half of this country would be under communism. Just try to imagine. And then suddenly that disappears, and then what happens? Revenge, of course, and things, and people losing positions and jobs, and others finally... It's such a dramatic period. Okay, once more. I know that I must say farewell to this melting land, but I cannot do so yet. There's too much unfinished business. Words and images are still entangled in my thoughts. Johann Georg Hamann saw in history ciphers, hidden signs, hieroglyphs of God. I do not know whether they belong to God, but after all those months, I feel enmeshed in those signs. They are scars on a living organism, as in Dresden, as in Potsdam. Germany is unfinished. It is ancient, but it's still being made, and that ambiguity makes it fascinating. Herder says that nations develop at different rates, like people. If you subscribe to that idea, you could say that France and England are fully formed, adult. We know them. But do we know Germany? Does Germany know itself? Does this country know what it wants to be when it is big? That was my line. You know, what will happen
when it grows up?
Because, of course, lots of people are afraid. Certainly the Germans themselves. Aren't you afraid of us? Young students. Because, you know, what happens to young people there was that at a certain point, after the war, a famous German psychologist called Mitscherlich wrote a book, Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, the
inability to mourn.
To mourn. And then it happened that the younger generation starts to look at their fathers, if they were still there, because most fathers were dead, but then their grandfathers, and they wanted to know, what did you do, what did you, what was your position? And then that generation is now the generation that is, let's say, in power, if such a thing exists. And that's an unknown quantity, I must say. But they're very, very much aware of the war and what has happened. And they will never escape, because it comes back at every single moment. There's always somebody who was exiled. There's always somebody who died. You know, in music, in literature, but in all kinds of aspects. It is a real, it's not that they're all occupied every day from morning to night with that, but it's still there, it's there. And if that's not there, they would be reminded by us, you know. There's a lot of, but okay. So, but do we know Germany? Does Germany know itself? Does this country know what it wants to be when it's big? You know, even after all these centuries, there's still no definition of Germany. It remains an enigma. In his latest book, Die Schere, that's the, what do you call it, the scissors. Ernst Jünger reflects upon that word. Enigma was a word shared by the Greeks and Romans for a puzzle, a secret, the unfathomable. Anyway, it's in Luther's translation, das dunkle Wort, the dark word. Germany is a dark word, as a spiritual mystery behind a veil of power and material success. As a country you can attempt to read ancient and yet the youngest of all European states. That's what people forget. Now, just a little passage. What awaits me now, that was 25, when I was going to leave after all these years. What awaits me now is a temporary cessation of entanglements, questions, and paradoxes. Ost money flows into West money. The border evaporates. One national anthem dissolves into the other. The embassies in East Berlin shrivel away. Elections in 6 months' time. The wars East and West revert to their former meanings. The entire map of the country in a single color. The chemical wedding of a male citizen of Cologne and a female citizen from Weimar, the platonic union of these two individuals as citizens of the only Germany that now exists, two citizens rocked in the arms of Europe, from which no country can now break free without injuring itself, though apparently some countries are trying to, with fatal, in my opinion, consequences. I decide to celebrate my farewell in the melancholy gardens of Sanssouci, which was the palace of Frederick the Great, and drive there over the Glinecker Brücke, Smiley's Bridge. It's weather for spies, squalls of rain, followed by vanilla-colored sunlight. A squad of Russians comes towards me, a long line of men carrying spades. They look like they've been walking for days, but that cannot be true, as they are not carrying any kit. I have to wait as they cross the road, and I get a good look at them, because it happens so slowly. There's something ancient about this passing crowd. Faces from all regions, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Russians, the great masses of the East. What is going through their minds? Their oversized caps perch on their heads. Some of them smile in the general direction of my car, but I cannot see what they are thinking. They have partly withdrawn from Hungary and Czechoslovakia already, but they will be staying here. There are no houses for them at home, no work. The changes can already be seen here in a world that is pulling away from their own. What sort of memories and opinions will they take with them when they return home? And how will those thoughts become deformed and return to us as a greater challenge than German unity? Oh, that's the point.
Bravo. Now, you mentioned Germany and Europe in the same sentence very, very often indeed. And you've actually said yourself, I may not be German, but I am certainly a European. And that is your great gift as well, is to see what happens to Germany in the context of Europe. And today, just before we open it up to all of you, I just want to mention this one, this extraordinary time that we have, this extraordinary week that we've been through in this country and through the rest of Europe. And in fact, the headlines today, as you probably know, Eurosceptic earthquake rocks the EU.
It was never going to be easy.
I was going to say, what is your take on that? And let's bring the lights up and have some questions from you.
Well, my take is I am a convinced European. And I wrote a little book, How to Become a European, and I said it's very easy. You only have to be born in Europe. You can do it in Sicily, you can do it in Amsterdam, and you can do it in Britain.
Even in Britain?
Yes, but in this...
How do we do it then?
Well,
what's top of your top 10 list?
Apparently you don't.
What, on your list of top 10 tips about how to be a European?
No, I mean, I have this kind of feeling that comes from, let's say, all these pronouncements coming from this island, which is a country that I've always admired. But still, I feel if people do not want to belong, then leave us. to our fate without you. But I have a feeling it would be a mistake, because the British have this idea, as far as I can see it, of a very special relationship to the United States. But the United States is not looking towards us. And now I mean really Europe, including Britain. Not really. They're looking towards the East.
So we could find ourselves very
Just
isolated.
as Mr. Putin is now looking towards the East, no longer towards us. So we'll be all by ourselves, all of us. And if you do not unite, then you'll be what?
Let's have some questions from you.
I suppose it's feasible that England can do it all by itself.
No comment. Let's hear what you think. And we've got some microphones, so you'd be kind enough to speak into the microphone when it comes around. And we've got a good 10 minutes. So start there, that'd be lovely, thank you. And there's one just up there as well, if there's another mic.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
You said early on that for... I'm over here.
Thank you.
I'll stand up, please, perhaps.
Oh, that's great. Thanks.
You said that when you were a child, the German language was the language of soldiers, and it was violent and frightening. And I wonder now, in a reformed Europe, what sort of associations you have specifically with the German language, and has it developed in your mind since then?
Thank you. Great question.
You know, if you look at any not so positive film about the war, Germans are always shouting. But if you live in Germany and you go at a poetry reading and you see a female poet, then it suddenly is a very beautiful language. And I suppose that goes for all languages. I think German is beautiful. We Dutch, we have a, you know, on the one hand, we could be jealous. If I would be writing in English, my God, what a difference would it make for me? But if you write in Dutch, you have to be translated. But the advantage is that we, for example, my wife and I, this morning, sitting in a bed and breakfast, with apparently about 5 French people, who I happen to understand because I speak French, but nobody can understand us. And I sometimes reflect on that, and I think it must be terrible to be English, because you never, ever can. And I can give you a small example of this. It's on the borderline of decency, of course, but I stood in an elevator in Lisbon, and with a Dutch-speaking Portuguese colleague who writes in Dutch, and there was a crew coming in of the South Afrikaanse luchtdienst. They are Afrikaans, you know, they speak a form of Dutch. And there was a rather tall, rather voluptuous stewardess saying to the rest of the crew, pointing, not pointing, but I knew whom she meant. So with this awful little, I would like to pass the night. And he immediately said, "Madam, any second of the night and the day at your service." See, that's, well, it happens, you see.
It happens, but it is a beautiful language. German is such a beautiful language, and I think that's something that we'd both like to say very much to the more people who learn German, the better. Any more questions? There's one here. Thank you.
You see, we in Holland, just to finish this, the time when I was young, it has changed now, but we had 3 foreign languages at school, obliged. So French, German, and English. So the German is already...
Oh, so you learnt German as a child?
Yeah, as a child, and then nowadays, because brains, as you know, have shrunken immensely, and nowadays it's no longer obligatory.
I think your brain started off pretty big.
But they don't have to do it now. They can either skip French or they can skip German. I think it's such a pity.
I totally agree. Gentleman here.
I'd just like to make a point. I disagree quite dramatically with your description of Germany, but you come from the most wonderful, tolerant, freedom-loving country, Holland, and maybe you're extending, being over-generous to Germany. I mean, at the moment, they're good Europeans. In the past, they were good Germans. In the West, they were good communists in the East. Before that, they were also very good Nazis. And you paint a picture which I don't think is there. They've just found a hall of art that was obviously stolen in Munich. They do nothing about it. The families that supplied the great industrial units that supplied the gas, the cars, the chemicals, the steel that funded the war are still there intact and worth many, many billions now. So it's a Germany that has carried on, and there's a certain amount of guilt with some of them, but it's a country that I think they're right to be frightened of for themselves and to carry on. And they're snuggling up to Europe is part of this, I think. I just hope it isn't the case.
Thank you very much. And if anybody else wants to say anything, do just put up your hand. There's a lady next to you. I think it was more of a statement. If you feel strongly, please do.
No, because...
But it would be nice to hear a few more voices.
And always the question is, what would other countries have done under the same circumstances? But then you could, of course, say, but they never got into those circumstances.
And you are quite critical of Germany as well.
I am quite critical of Germany. You will find all that in the book if you want. But how could a continent live on if you would stay the same now? I don't see. The whole idea of Europe was to reconcile those old differences. And if you think historically, after the First World War, the peace forced on Germany made Hitler possible. There's no doubt about it. So part of the blame has to go other parts as well. The Versailles peace was so horrible for a country already defeated. And it's not horrible in the sense of dramatic, but it was simply impossible. And that's then the crisis, and then somebody comes along once, I mean, thank God, only very, very few times in history, somebody comes along and uses that kind of situation, which was Hitler. And there's no doubt about it how dreadful it all was. No doubt about it. And they know. Sorry, well, okay.
We'll just hear, I'd like to hear as many voices from the audience as possible.
Mine is just to disassociate myself with the last statement. I'm a European. I realise now, visited Germany every year for the last 25 years because I was there when the wall came down.
Can you hold it a little bit closer to your mouth? Thank you.
And I have German friends and have met many Germans, and this picture painted is absolutely not one that I recognise, but I respect somebody has an opinion. I just wanted to counter it.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, and have we got, let's hear some more. Could you get the mics to people as quickly as possible? Thank you. Sorry, I know we make you run, but thank you.
Thanks. I was just wondering what you thought about the future of Berlin. Berlin's probably at a time now, for the first time in 100 years, where it's not in a kind of dramatic historical period. Do you think it still has potential to continue being a kind of dramatic and exceptional city? Or do you think it'll move to be a kind of, you know, in the same kind of humdrum global base as other major European capitals?
Thank you.
You know, Germany is, contrary to England and France, Germany has many capitals. Of course, Berlin is the official capital, and that's where the government is. But the other cities, Hamburg, Munich, are just as important. And I don't see, you know, of course, in the news you will hear Berlin said or Berlin did or that, but it's just a German city where the government happens to be.
Where there are lots of building sites, lots.
Yes. I, you know, having lived there in that period, you always see the signs where the East was a certain kind of architecture, And there's also a cicatrice running through that whole city.
A wound, a scar.
Wound, yes, a scar. And the future of Germany, I can't predict it. They're doing well, as we all know.
And Berlin is such a magnet for young people too. That's what really
no, but
struck me when I was there recently.
something dramatically strange about that. But if everything is destroyed, you have to build up everything anew. You have a lot of new things, which happens to help when you're in the economy.
Got a question here. Thank you.
Just a bit of clarification on your previous point regarding the Treaty of Versailles. I think if you look at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that the Germans inflicted on the USSR, or what became that, there was a lot of similar provisions that were absolutely horrid as well, but that's neither here nor there. I just want to say, as an American in Europe, we hope that Europe stays as it is, and the UK needs to be in Europe, first of all. But second of all, I'd also like to say, we in America, and I think also here in the UK, we don't have the same experience of being a defeated country that Germany had after World War II, and the way they've gone about their business since then in the West has been absolutely admirable. Of course, you can criticize a couple of collective amnesia that has occurred, but nevertheless, we don't have that same experience. We don't know what we would do. I just think that as the memory of World War II fades into the background, we do have a bit of a different period here all throughout Europe, where you have guys like Dieudonné in France just shouting horrible things, and it's important that we keep this collective memory alive. Do you have any suggestions of how to do that?
Well, yes. I must say, like the gentleman before said, Holland's such a tolerant country. It doesn't look like it lately, because we had a small party of the so-called Freedom Party, which if it would ever rain, that would be the end of freedom, and is extremely anti-Islam and all that. And of course, there is a reaction in all of our countries to mass immigration. It's a fact. And I think, but this is very personal, I think we will end up like Brazil. And I don't see anything wrong with it, but it's a very painful period to go through, and mostly for the people who are most affected by it, who are normally not the people having, let's say, the background of international travel. It's the poor neighborhoods where those people come in, where they're not used to it. And this is the problem Britain faces, as far as I can see, but also in Holland. And, mass migration. Europe has always been a mass migrating society. If you think of British history, you got some influx before, long ago, of the Franks and the whatevers. It's only when it happens. We are living history, and immigration is history.
And you're a great living historian. We have to end this event.
I don't have the wisdom of everything. I'm not Jesus in the temple, but and I've understood that to understand Europe nowadays.
We've got a red flashing light here. One quick question, please. Thank you.
Sir, enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
As a young person in the occupied times, is it possible that you just met one nice German?
I will tell you, because I have a memory. I once did something very strange, which in retrospect I cannot fully comprehend. I had no watch, and I went up to a German officer and I asked what time it was. And he told me. And as a child, you notice from your look that he probably had a child my age at home. This is all. I mean, what? All those, one is made up of one's memories, isn't one?
And stories.
God knows.
I'm so sorry to have to end it here. It always happens this way. We get into wonderful conversations. If you'd like to continue your conversations with Cees, do come to the bookshop afterwards. He'll be signing books. But I want to say thank you to the Royal Society of Literature, thank you to the European Commission, and thank you to all of you. But thank you, most of all, to Cees Nooteboom. Thank you.